Okay, great. Is the overlay shown on my screen or not? Because it's on taken up from my
All we see is the presentation.
Great. Okay, so I'll be talking about visual novels as a canvas and the importance of maintaining a unified visual aesthetic. So a little about me to start off with first. I've been a logo and UI designer for visual novels since 2015. I've also been around producing my own visual novels since around the same time as well, having released 2 free titles, and my most recent one, Chemically Bonded, which was my first commercial title. I also set up and manage the LoveVN Discord server and Twitter account, which some of you might have heard of, but if not, that's fine. I'd like to think I know a little bit about creating a VN with a good sense of visual cohesion from my time working with them as both an artist and a director as well. You can be the judge of that if you find what I say useful, but I'd still like to share my thoughts with everyone and what I've learned these past 4.5 years about using visual design to your advantage. So to really understand what goes into visual novel design, we have to break down each aspect of visual in visual novel and how each piece fits together. I'd also like to talk about what a unified visual aesthetic is, since I'll be using that term a lot today. It's as straightforward as it sounds, really, having everything be consistent, but there are certain ways to do things that I'd like to focus on. I'll also be discussing how keeping consistency is important from both a development perspective and from players' standpoint too, alongside various ways visual design can be improved. I've put a sample of programs here since a lot of work takes place in a graphics editor, but also takes place in an engine itself, in this case, RenPy. And we also have Photoshop, GIMP, and Paint.net here on screen. There's a vast array of software, and each of them has their own merits. I'd say these are the most common ones for graphic designers, whereas a character artist would use Clip Studio Paint or Paint Toolsci. So visual design can be broken down into each different aspect of a visual novel, essentially what appears on screen. So you have character art, your sprites, CGs, and anything else related to your characters. Character art is probably the number one thing people are going to define your VN by without reading it. And of course, it's the most important thing in being able to tell a story visually. Background art, the setting you're seeing for your visual novel. This is also just as important as character art and telling your story visually as well. User interface, what the player interacts with and reads from. A lot of people seem to ignore the importance of this, and that really upsets me as a UI artist. But since this is typically laid above the character and background art, I'd say it's important in its own right. I'll breeze for the rest of these. You have, I can't see it because there's things in my way there. Colors, the main palette of your visual novel. Fonts, the size, style, and position of your text. Animations and effects, any additional flair used to breathe in life into your visual novel. And then the engine, finally, what you're using to make your VN in. All of these aspects and more play into the overall visual design and work in tandem with one another to create a unified visual experience. So along with these aspects about visual design, I want to know what the VN community thinks and feels of what is good visual novel design. So I asked a few people in the community, and as you can see, the general consensus is that good visual design is something that fits together as a puzzle. Each aspect works together to create an embodied experience throughout the VN and delivers what you want players to see. As Howard Jones puts it, graphics are there to deliver a message, and that's very true in the case of visual novels, just as much as the story is. While a novel part delivers its own message in its own way, the visuals also help to deliver such a message too. So before I go any further, it's important to talk about what limitations there are when it comes to implementing a coherent visual design. It's safe to say a developer's ability to enhance visual design comes down to financial or skill limitations, be that the lack of funds or knowledge available to work on visual elements. I'd like to focus on today on what makes a good visual novel design, away from having the ability or resources to improve them. As a previous slide showed, we can ask people what makes good visual design good, but it's important to understand that ourselves. Not being able to hire the right artist for your project or not being able to produce a lot of the artwork yourself will of course affect how your final product looks. It's not right to tell people that their visual design is bad because of the factors they can't change. And visual design is not necessarily tied to money or skill. It's to do with the thought process of how to make what you have work well. There's a lot of good-looking visual novels made with Creative Commons assets, small teams, or even just made by one person. Everyone has their own opinions on what works and what doesn't, and that's important to note. So what is a unified visual aesthetic? I define it as a common theme that runs through your VN, and similarly your promotional materials as well. It should reflect the game and genre and tone of your story. If you're making a horror VN, you wouldn't necessarily use a bright pastel palette with a flowery aesthetic. Similarly, a lovey-dovey romance VN shouldn't be dark and gloomy. Your aesthetic should be easily identifiable. Your visual novel is a brand, and people can recognize it when a lot of the visual aspects work together in tandem. It should be consistent in all aspects of your project. Your user interface, your character designs, your marketplace presence, everything should work together instead of standing out from one another. A unified visual aesthetic is a combination of all these elements. As shown before, there are a lot of these elements in a visual novel. Consider these aspects like bricks. They lay the foundation of what your VN is going to be like without the player reading it. A good set of visuals paired with good writing is an award-winning formula for VNs. They stack upon one another, sprites above the background, UI above the sprites, and in the end, everything is still one image, which the player's eyes read and see. So here we have two examples of VN visual designs, which have different designs. Of course, we can break these down between good and bad, but they're subjective terms, so take these points with a grain of salt. More than an observation of two types of VNs in the industry. So on the left, we have an example of good visual design, something that uses a unified aesthetic, whereas on the right, something a little more disorganized. Bad is a very harsh word, but in this case, I'm going to use it as an example of incoherent visual design. First, the color palettes of each image. As you can see, the palette itself on the left is very uniform as a whole. All the colors are very similar. They work together well as a piece. Whereas on the right, the palette is a lot more disorganized and varied, and it clashes more with one another. Having a palette that works is a very important part of creating a uniform visual design. A lot of good-looking VNs will usually have a coherent palette, as shown on the last slide. Similarly, aspect ratio. Having an aspect ratio that works for most players is also very important in creating a design that works. While it's a technical aspect of a VN, if your aspect ratio doesn't work, then your visual novel isn't going to look as good as a reader's screen as one which does. 16:9 is the best for this, which is what the one on the left is, whereas on the right is 16:10. You'll only work on a handful of monitors, and otherwise it'll show black bars on the side without being stretched. Finally, the artwork. It's important to have art styles that match one another. As the VN on the left shows, the sprites, background, and user interface don't clash as much as the styles on the right do. We could break down the visuals of these images further, like how the image on the right uses a very basic font compared to the unique ones on the left, but that depends on how pedantic you are about aesthetics. So there are two approaches to developing a VN, which most people will be familiar with. One for profit and one just for fun. If you have the ability to spend money on making a good VN, then you should. Neglecting your visuals is the worst thing you can do. Having a budget is a crucial part of development and should be used wisely. If you can't do certain things yourself or consider your skills in these areas poor, then consider hiring an artist to assist you. Be it a character, background, or a UI artist, having one on board is particularly useful and it still suits your project with great benefit. There's a variety of artists out there with different skills and different payment rates. Find one that works for you. I wouldn't recommend hiring a most popular artist or the most expensive one you can find. There are a lot of people out there who might suit your project better, and supporting these people is a very good thing. A few sites I'd recommend for finding artists are Lemonsoft, DeviantArt, and Pixiv, but you can find people on Twitter and Discord too for commissions. If you decide to hire artists for your project, then understanding how to work with them will benefit the final appearance of your VN. Directing an artist with the use of references and feedback through the design process makes it easier for them to design something akin to what you have in your head. An artist can't read your mind or work with them closely to reach something that suits your project. Every artist is different, and so each will have their own interpretation of what you're asking for. Try to find an artist who already has a style similar to what you're after. Don't expect people to do everything you asked. However, some people can't do certain things, and that's fair enough. Most people's incomes depend on commissions, so be certain that you can find someone who suits your project well. Another approach to making VNs is the budget method, not spending money on hiring people and instead doing things yourself or working closely with others to develop a VN. I think there's a big perception that if you're not spending money on your VN, it can't look good, and that certainly isn't the case. Even if you can't find any volunteers or don't have any friends who can help you, there are plenty of places to find assets other people have shared that you're able to use under Creative Commons. I'll show a few of these on my next slide. Ooh. The other alternative is to spend time looking at the skills you need to create a good looking VN. Don't let your dreams be dreams if you want to become an artist of any sort. VN development is a good way to improve your skills over time. I've done that myself over the past 4 years, creating user interfaces for many visual novels. And then finally, the best looking visual novels aren't the ones with the best artwork. They're the ones where you can clearly tell that someone's put effort into it. If you're making a VN for fun, the last thing you should really care about is how good your VN looks. As long as you're happy with the final result, that's all that matters. So here are a few examples I've picked out of where you can find assets for your visual novels. The Lemmasoft forums has a Creative Commons section, which is really useful. You can find all sorts there, not just visual things, but music as well. And I think that's really a great place to look. itch.io, also a great place for hosting assets. People post things for free or you can purchase them. And DL site as well, you can find a lot of good assets there. For example, background materials that some people don't really know exist. So to conclude, understanding what goes into a VN's visuals is important. There are plenty of elements to it, and if I had more time, I would go over each aspect in finer detail. There are plenty of people with experience in all these areas. If you don't have that experience yourself, finding someone else who does can benefit the look of your VN, be it through hiring an artist or using assets shared by the community. Finally, the last point I'd like to make is that visual novels are art. There isn't a true divide between something that looks good and something that looks bad. That's up to the observer, whether that's you or your audience. Having unified design is one step in creating the artwork, and as long as you're proud of what you've done and share it with the world. I know I'm well ahead of schedule, so I apologize for that. That's about it. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, then don't hesitate to get in touch with me on Twitter or through Discord or sending questions now. I'd be happy to answer them or respond to anything, really. I feel like I've rushed through this. I've only been doing it for 12 minutes, I think. But I can certainly go into detail for anyone who wants to get in touch with me. I'd also like to thank everyone who let me use their screenshots too as well, and everything else I've included on these slides belongs to their respective copyright holders.
All right.
That's it.
Yeah. Crazy car just went by. Okay. Thank you for that talk. And that means that we have just more time for questions. That's all. No big deal.
Brilliant.
Oh boy, here they come. If you have the time to learn everything as you go and have no production schedule whatsoever, cool. But wait, that's not a question. All right. People put questions and it's hard for me to keep up with everything. But otherwise, if not, I can always just put Discord onto the thing for it to be recorded. Wait, someone read the questions for me. I've got to take care of a small thing.
Question, do you have tools for doing a palette shift for unifying CC assets?
Not too sure what that question's asking. I think, is that asking, do I have tools to change the color of Creative Commons aspects? Because a lot of what I do is in Paint.net, I can normally change the hue and saturation of an image, whereas if you have an image like a sprite, for example, you can't exactly change the hair color without a lot of technical pain. Some artists do have PSD files available, which are really good. You can change the hue of a specific layer, and for example, if someone's hair, I think that's really nice.
Any logo tips for someone going the budget route?
Logos are quite a difficult one for the budget route. I would recommend trying it yourself. The software I use, Paint.net, is free software, so anyone can download it for free compared to Photoshop, or GIMP's free as well. There are plenty of tutorials on YouTube, so I'd recommend trying that out. If not, some people do logos for free as well, so try and look around, see if you can find anyone who do it for free for you.
Do you recommend hiring multiple artists with the primary art director, or keeping with 1 or 2 artists to try to keep it consistent?
Keeping with 1 or 2 artists, I'd say, is better, but if you can find a lot of artists who have similar styles, then it would be quicker, it'd speed up the development process. I like how everyone's posting that in the chat.
If someone doesn't
Okay,
do a panel next year
beta.
called "I didn't like your VN talk."
It's peak copy material.
Oh God, yeah. Okay. While that stuff is going, there is a question hiding in here. Do you think beta testers should be friends or people completely unrelated to the author? Wait, what does that have to earn?
I think there should be a mix of both, ideally, because having your friends do it, you can trust them not to share your project, and they'll give you feedback that people generally value more, whereas if you send it to a stranger, you might get some comments you might not like, but that's healthy as well. You need honest feedback, so I'd recommend a mix of people to test it for you.
What would be a situation where you might consider breaking the established rules like the ones you've stated?
Generally, when it comes to money, that's when you should start breaking rules. I'd say if you're starting off without a budget, then there's no real rules to set you on your path. Whereas working commercially, you have to make decisions, you have to cut corners. So that's generally the sort of situation where I'd break those rules.
All right, let's see. What's the most important thing when conceptualizing a logo?
I think it should fit with the UI as well. If I go back and read one of these quotes. Yeah, Flashfire Dev, fit in with the theme and even the logo of the VN. The logo should fit the VN itself. It should convey what the VN's about, generally speaking.
All right, let's see. Do you dedicate your time for pre-production and establishing your game's brand and design, or do you tweak as you go due to limitations?
I tweak as I go, really. I do have a pre-production schedule of what I want it to look like, and I think all developers should generally have a pre-production idea of what they want their VN to look like in the end, whereas sometimes you do have to change things as you go, you get better ideas, so it's generally a mix of both as well, I'd say.
See, someone's asking, do you have a game that you suggest that has great UI style that's available on Steam?
Steins Gate, I'd say, has a very nice UI style. It's one of my favorite VNs. I think it's not as conventional. I've taken a lot of inspiration from that for my last VN, so I'd recommend that.
Cool. All right. I think we got time for one more. How can you predict the ways to deviate from the normal expected aesthetic for effect, i.e. a grittier aesthetic, but more heartwarming story?
I think that depends on what sort of story you're writing, really, and how you want to manipulate the player. Like, for example, DDLC does that. It doesn't present itself as what it is, so it sort of uses its visual aesthetic to manipulate the player. I think if you try to accomplish something like that, even on a minor scale, that's when you'd do that sort of thing.
Okay, someone mentioned that, okay, you mentioned standard aspect ratios. What are some other standards that should generally be held for every VN?
I'd say it's a very subjective thing. That's quite difficult to answer. I think text is a very important thing to have standardized. If you're creating a VN and your text should be legible, you shouldn't choose a font that people can't read.
All right, so we're down to our last minute. So I'm going to give presenter mode to Els, who is up next, and Els can set up. And thank you very much. I know there's like a lot more questions that we can get into. Just head on the chat and you can continue the discussion there.